addiction is one thing that its deception was so incredible that you think you're going to get away with it. And the denial element that comes in is part of that mixture of deception. And I always call it the line of addiction, because we can be having a heck of a good time here. And slowly, while you're having what you think is a great time, the addiction line slowly passes under you, and the next thing you are in it. But because of the deception, you don't see it. So you're just in denial, saying, no, I don't have a problem. I was like that, I didn't have a problem. But I was using every day, but I didn't have a problem. I was out in the streets and I didn't have a problem. They had a problem, they were worse, not me. I wasn't that bad. And it wasn't till I was involved with somebody who died from overdose that I realized maybe there is something bad here, maybe. And when somebody else pointed out to me, do you do this, do you do this, do you do this? And I said, yeah, so what? So what, is that normal? But normal for me that day was sick. My father, who was in the city, never really was involved. He would leave early in the morning, come back late at night. So I didn't see much of him, but he was somebody I really respected for who he was and what he had achieved, and he had done very well. And so had my family overall, had all done very well, and then there was me. And I, at school, did not do well. I did appallingly. I had dyslexia, which people didn't really understand at that point in time. And I wouldn't have liked myself because I was a wet. I didn't have any strength, and that's a lot to do with my upbringing. Then I was sent to a special school, which was down to sort of 20 students. It was meant to specialize in education improvement for dyslexia. And that's when a few things started to happen as far as adults' interference in my life. And one was I was sexually abused by two separate teachers. I had no idea it was wrong. It was, for me, age 7, it was just, I don't know, I just maybe saw it as love. It was extraordinary. And then we had a very sadistic headmaster who enjoyed beating the boys for any chance and any reason that he had. And the beatings were, he would bring you into his room and he'd open up his cupboard. He said, choose the shoe that you want. And you would choose the shoe, usually the tacky, the gym shoe. And you've got to realize that he was 6'1.5", 6.5 foot, which is tall for a 7-year-old. He'd take that, bend you over, and hit you. And all of this sort of thing slowly took me out. With everything that had happened to me in the past, I had really started to rebel against life. And with that, I smoked at school. It was part of being part of the right team, right guys. It was exciting. We used to go out into the forests and have hoodies up and rush into the forest and sit there and smoke. And I was part of something, and it felt good. And I wasn't the goody-goody. I enjoyed that rebel bit of it. And my behavior had come about, and obviously with all that sort of stuff, I wasn't being totally honest either. So in the end, I left the school. I definitely had a stronger belief in myself, whatever that might have been. Academically, I did terribly. I didn't pass anything of any subset. I got O levels, sure, but even that, they weren't great passes. So my next adventure was to go to Australia, which I went to for a year on a voluntary services, and I ended up on a cattle and sheep station, and that was amazing. That was really good fun. I mean, that again was I suppose I was looking for the sort of butch look of being a jackaroo. It was cowboy on horses and Marlboro men and things like that. That's what I was looking for, and it was really cool, and motorbikes. And that was very cool. And of course there I learned how to drink. And we drank a lot. Because there's not a lot else you can do there. And anyway, I came back and I got into the audiovisual industry. And from that, I found my talent. And it was a God-given gift, which was basically sound. And I got into the recording studios in London, and it was fantastic. And of course, by being in the recording studios and in what is now the film industry, there were a lot of drugs around. And I got introduced to marijuana, and then speed, and then cocaine. And it was all being part of this thing of being part of a group of people that just look cool. And that's really what I was after more than anything else. Never in my life did I think that I would end up where I did. I was just having fun. And anyway, so time moved on, and slowly, with the progression of all this, was the cocaine and the marijuana wasn't enough, and I got introduced to heroin, which I was very scared of. It was the big H. And I thought, I'm not going to touch that. And then just one night, a friend of mine said, I'm off to score. Do you want to come with? So I came in and I walked into this room, and there were all these guys, and they were the heavies. They were the heavies of thinking. I thought, this is cool. This is where I want to be. I was really rebelling against society, my family, everything. And I took a toot at that time. I chased the dragon on some heroin I was given, and I felt incredible. And then I promptly went and vomited, and I thought, oh, I won't do that again. Needless to say, 6 months later, I got into it again, and then it all sort of became quite a thing with friends. We used to do it on a Saturday night, and that was cool, all great. And then it became Friday and Saturday night, and that was okay. That was okay. And then it became every other night, and then every night. But that was okay. For me, that there was nothing wrong. But I was changing. I was changing as a person. I was losing weight. I was being incredibly dishonest. My behavior and my irrationality and my anger was just getting greater. My survival modes were kicking in of how to survive to make sure that I got what I needed as far as drugs were concerned. And so I just literally would prepare my day of knowing how I was going to get the money, how I was going to score, where I was going to score, and making sure that I could. And my life was surrounded by getting and using. And that is really what happened. And when I couldn't get that, I would get drunk. And this went on for quite a few years. I was spending all my money until I had literally nothing. My family had no idea what was going on. My father's position didn't really... I think they were in denial more than anything else, as I was. I was in complete denial that I had a problem. And yet I was using every day. And I also lost my job in the sound studios. I tried to do freelancing. And I just had some people who just were good to me and just kept me going as far as the job was concerned, but that didn't last. And then in the end, I was out. And I ended up in all-night cinemas in Leicester Square with all the other addicts and alcoholics, tramps. And I thought they were really bad, because I'd sit in the cinema and look at them and go, God, they're bad, because they had all the usual really cheap wine and everything, and they were badly dressed, and this is what was going through, and I was judging them, and comparing myself to them and making myself feel better over them. And yet I was leaving the cinema towards the end every half hour, just to use and feel normal. So that's where it got to. I was literally in the gutter. And I was using anything and everything, and I was stealing I didn't care. I didn't care what I did to everybody around me. I didn't care what I did to the people who I was stealing from. It was all about me. It was all about my addiction, and that was it. My family had clearly didn't want me to be around because I was not nice. And then by the grace of God, I was introduced to the 12-step program, which I laughed at initially because I couldn't work out why on earth you'd want to have a higher power, because I didn't believe in God. And as I was told, it didn't matter. You just had to have something bigger than you. And well, the biggest thing in me was me. And so far, I had done a pretty bad job of me. So I went to rehab and I got myself in, and I thought I'd just go in there and clean out. I just wanted to try and stop. I'd tried to stop on my own before and I couldn't. I might have stopped for 3 months and had a huge celebration and thought I'd just do it once. And once wasn't enough, and then I had again and again, and I was back to where I was, in fact worse than where I was from when I tried to stop the first time. It was just harder and harder to stop. And I was in the rehab for 3 months, and it was a nightmare. But there was one day where I was in absolute agony from withdrawals, and I hadn't slept for 10 days. I was exhausted, and I was in physical pain, and I'd had enough, and I was weak. And they had a small theatre off the rehab, which used to be an old chapel. And I just wanted to go in there and sit for a while. And I did. And having gone in there on my own, it was like a relief in some aspects just to take time out from the program that I was on in the rehab, which was quite aggressive. And I sat there silently, and I just sat there, and I just said, how on earth did I get here? And then I just got on my knees because I didn't know anything else to do. I just got on my knees, and I sat there for a while on my knees. And then I finally said, well, who are you? Because if you're there, please just help me. Just take this, whatever it is. And I remember saying that very clearly. And after a while, I got up and I left. And I went and carried on with the rehab. But from that day onwards, something very extraordinary happened that I know happened because it's affected me for the rest of my life. That moment, God allowed me to sleep for an hour. And that was like having a whole night's sleep. And then it turned into 2 hours, then it turned into 3, and then 4. 4 was enough. 4 was right enough for me from not having anything. And the most incredible thing was my craving had left. I never had, to this day, from that moment, another craving. It had gone. However, I still had addiction, and I knew that. So I left the rehab, and I learned about the 12-step program. And in the rehab, and I knew that I had a higher power. I got into a higher power, and it was something bigger than me. And I said, well, if it's God, it's God, so it must be something bigger than me. And I didn't really understand God. But I worked on the higher power for a long, long time, and I worked on the steps. I did 90 meetings in 90 days. Best thing I ever did. Best thing I ever did. Today, no problem, because I have that relationship with Jesus. And that is what's changed my life. My higher power also changed my life, because it was Jesus all the time. But I had to find out who my higher power was. And in that process, he revealed himself to me. But I understand that anybody thinking, oh, I don't want to be part of that, you don't have to be part of that. What you do have to be a part of is a program that is proven in helping addicts find the bridge to normality in life and away from active addiction. And the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, you name it, they all are working, and they are all over the world. Then suddenly an opportunity to leave the meeting, leave England and come to South Africa. And I arrived in South Africa and there was no meetings. And I actually arrived in 1982. And I went to meetings. I went to the AA meetings, and they were fantastic. I had my first birthday in a meeting in Johannesburg, and it was fantastic, and everybody loved it. But the one thing they said, please don't bring up drugs. We deal with alcohol here. So this became a little bit of a problem, and to the point they suggested that I started my own meeting. So Narcotics Anonymous started in South Africa in a treatment centre in the north of Joburg, and it had to be in a treatment centre. It wasn't allowed to be autonomous because in those days legislation said in South Africa 2 or more addicts meeting together is illegal. So I met we got the treatment centre, and it worked and it grew. And I was going to those meetings every day. And my strength in that grew and grew and grew. But the biggest thing that really helped me was helping others, because by helping others I could see myself and reminding me who I was, because I didn't want to go back there again. And the other thing about the 12-step program was that I began to understand what my addiction was. And I married, and had a fantastic, I was very much in love with my first wife. But I was traveling a lot, and unfortunately, she left me for somebody else, which was really tough. And it takes two to stuff up a marriage, and I think my behavior, I hadn't dealt with him properly, and I had a terrible anger. And yeah, I think if I was married to me, I would probably have left me for somebody else. So I carried on, and I was running my film company, which I had started a company in South Africa. And it was a lot of pressure. And then I had a heart attack. And during that heart attack, I was offered morphine. I actually didn't know I was given morphine because I was almost in a coma. But when I came around, I recognized the feeling, and it was terrifying because I knew I liked it. I knew I liked it. And while in ICU, the second day, the nurse came up and said, would you like a painkiller? Because I was in pain. I said, yes, I would. And when they gave it to me, I realized again, this was pethidine. And I so knew that feeling, and it was good. But it was terrifying because I did not want to go back there. And I had to make a decision there, whether I was going to just lie in hospital and be fed on pethidine, or whether I needed to actually just deal with my addiction. I got tested. And only by the strength of my recovery and the fellowship and the meetings, I was able to say no. And my other addiction, which I didn't realize until I got onto the recovery course and started running it, was the one course which was the starters. We had groups, and we had to put a sex addicts group together, and we had to put them in their own group initially, and somebody had to run it. And so timidly I went in and ran that group in the recovery course, and it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And I found this with all the groups in the recovery course, not only the stories that are told on the videos before you start, but it was just the sincerity of Nigel giving his talks on the videos were just enlightening. and Jesus-driven. And so I sat in this sex addicts group looking at all the guys and saying so, and it was mind-blowing, the honesty that came out. And it was really, really, really deep honesty about addiction of their sex addiction. I realized I had a problem when after the second week running, I'm sitting there going, so what's wrong with that? And it was bad. And I then began to realize a lot of my behavior and value for women was not true. It was based on sex rather than a true love relationship. And I thought sex was love as I knew it, because I'd never really learned about what love was. And so that group was mind-blowing. I had gained so much from realizing that my addiction wasn't just alcohol and drugs and gambling. It was sex. I know that if anybody said you must go to church and meet Jesus to recover, I would have run. I had an allergic reaction to Christian people. I didn't like them. They were too good, or they were too smiley, or they were too unrealistic, and they didn't understand life. That's what I thought. And so if anybody had come to me and said, right, you're coming to a recovery course and it's in a church, I would have been very, very suspicious. Yeah, I would be totally understanding of why people wouldn't want to come to a recovery course, because it's Jesus, they think it's Jesus. It's a Christian-based program which you can choose to use Jesus if you want, otherwise your higher power. And it's amazing. It really is the most amazing program I have ever had in my life. And I just know that if everybody got onto the 12-step program, it would be a better world. And that is what the recovery course has based itself on, is strength, hope, and your experience. And my experience with the 12-step program and the recovery course is I'm seeing lives change.